We're live. So. I want to welcome our audience as they're logging on, and we're going to start the discussion, start the activities in about 2 minutes. We'll be starting in about 1 minute if everybody's wondering why we're sitting here silently. Just want to wait for everybody to log on, and I keep seeing people keep logging on.
Good. That's what you want.
All right, well, let's get started. Good morning. My name is Gary Grotto. I'm the executive editor of the Arizona Capital Times, and this is Morning Scoop. And today's topic is the state of the Colorado River and what to expect over the next couple of years. And we're also going to talk about Arizona's conservation efforts. Now, we've had significant developments since the last time our panel met in May. And our panelists are all leaders for their respective organizations, and they're searching for a solution to our water crisis, and they're eager to talk about it. But first, I'd like to take a moment to give a nod to our sponsors. And in alphabetical order, we have Central Arizona Project, which delivers water to Maricopa, Pinal, and Pima counties, and serves nearly 6 million people, or more than 80% of the state's population. Next, we have EPCOR, which provides clean water and safe, reliable energy in Canada and the United States. EPCOR USA is the largest utility. It's the largest utility company in the Southwest and largest in Arizona, providing clean water, wastewater services, wholesale water, and natural gas services to 800,000 people in 42 communities in 18 counties in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. And finally, we have Salt River Project. It's our third sponsor. SRP is a community-based, not-for-profit organization providing affordable water and power to more than 2 million people in Central Arizona. It's made up of two separate organizations, the Association, which is a private water corporation founded in 1903, and the District, which is an electricity provider formed as an agricultural improvement district in a political subdivision state of Arizona in 1937. I want to thank all of you for your support and for having this discussion today. So before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to introduce Terry Goddard. He's the president of the Central Arizona Water Conservation District Board of Directors, which is the governing board of Central Arizona Project. And Terry is going to give us a few opening remarks.
Thank you, Gary, and thanks to all of you who zoomed in for this this webinar, this scoop, for your interest in Arizona water and its future. Just a little context, if you will. I was mayor in 1985 when the first CAP water got to Phoenix, and I'd never forget the tagline at that occasion, which was, "Our lifeline is online," and it literally was true. Until a couple of years ago, the CAP delivered 1.5 or more million acre feet of Colorado River water to Central Arizona customers. And that resulted in extraordinary growth in the area that we served. Hundreds of billions of dollars of new development came because our lifeline was truly online. And that continued until about 2 years ago. As I'm sure everyone on this Zoom knows, we have a drought on the Colorado River, over a 20-year drought. And as a result, the lifeline was cut by a third in 2021. And we took our first major hits. And now the panel that we're going to be talking with today is engaged in the discussions on the Colorado River between the 7 basin states on what the next allocation arrangement is going to be, which will have to be adopted in 2 years. So those discussions are vigorous, they're ongoing. And let me emphasize that the lifeline could be threatened in those discussions. So we have a lot on the table from Arizona at risk in how those agreements are ultimately settled. So this is a critical discussion. It's a very important issue for the future of our state. And I very much thank you for your interest and continued participation in the future of Arizona water. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you, Terry. And our panel is made up of Tom Bushatsky. He's the director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources. Good morning, Tom.
Morning, Gary.
And we also have Brenda Berman. She's the general manager of the Central Arizona Project. I'm going to say good morning to everybody at the end here. Leslie Myers, SRP's Chief Water Executive and Associate General Manager of Water Resources. And we also have Doug Dunham. He's the Manager of Water Resources for EPCOR USA. So good morning to all of you, and thank you for joining us this morning. And before we get started, I'd like to just talk a little bit about how the chat. We are not going to be using the chat as we usually do. But if you have questions for the panelists or comments, if you could please put them in the Q&A, and I will look for them in there. So let's get started. So as I mentioned earlier, this panel met in May, and the big news then was the agreement between Arizona, Nevada, and California to cut their use of the Colorado River water in exchange for massive federal payments. So Tom and Brenda, if you could take the lead on this, what's the status of the proposal that the lower basin states agreed to in May to protect the system through 2026?
Tom?
Yeah, Gary, I'll start in what we submitted to the federal government on May 22nd earlier this year was a proposal for an alternative for the federal government to analyze in the draft supplemental environmental impact statement process. A draft came out in April of last spring. That draft had 2 alternatives, which would have been very harmful to Arizona if chosen. In one alternative, Central Arizona Project would have gone to 0. And Arizona farmers in the Yuma area in certain situations would have been severely cut, potentially to 0 as well. The other alternative 2 that they were looking at was not quite as harmful, but still harmful to the state. So given the better hydrology last winter and the ability, because of the federal program with Inflation Reduction Act money, we were able to target entities who would voluntarily put their water on the table for that money to conserve it and keep it in Lake Mead. Some other action items would occur to keep water in Lake Mead as well. But adding 3 million acre feet of conserved water through 2026, with 1.5 million of that coming in the first 2 years. So that would, in our opinion, create some robust protection for Lake Mead and the Colorado River through 2026 and get us to the next set of the operating guidelines, which I guess we'll talk about later. And so it was a good outcome. It was purely voluntary. And I believe, at least in Arizona, 1 million acre feet or thereabouts has been signed, sealed, and delivered. with the federal government. I know much of Nevada's reductions were just a reduction of use rather than compensated conservation. And they're still working with California to sign, seal, and deliver substantial parts of the proposal and the conserved water in California. So we're well on our way. The federal government is analyzing that alternative, and this fall they'll come out with a new draft environmental impact statement, and we'll see what they put in that document and how and if they propose to choose the alternative put together by the lower basin states rather than alternative 1 or 2, and that's yet to be determined by the federal government. And I'll stop, and maybe Brenda wants to add.
Sure. I think it's a record-breaking conservation incentive is what has been put together. It calls for 3 million acre-feet through 2026. In Arizona this year, uncompensated reductions that we're taking were over 592,000 acre-feet. That's part of past agreements we've made. That has caused some real pain in Arizona. But parties still stepped up. So just within the CAP service area, the River Indian community, we have the cities have stepped up. It's over 230,000 acre-feet this year. So all told, Arizonans, whether it's been uncompensated through past decisions, whether it's been state and tax money that have looked to different parties, or the federal funding, which has been robust, we are putting over 900,000 acre-feet towards Lake Mead this year. That's just in 2023. If you saw, the United States puts out a report every month, the 24-month study. And when it looks ahead 2 years, it said, we are stable. The program is working. The point is for us to have stability on the river through 2026 so that we can pivot and start working on our real medium and long-term solutions.
Now, just to put that into perspective, 3 million acre-feet, how much water per year is the lower basin states allocated under the 1922 compact? I mean, is that just to give us a comparison and some perspective?
7.5 million acre-feet is allocated to the lower basin states and 1.5 million to Mexico.
Okay. So that's a lot of water that we're putting back in, or that we're saving. So Leslie, can you give us the status of the SRP reservoir system?
Absolutely. Thanks, Gary. This time last year, the Salt River project system was about 70% full. We had a very robust monsoon last year and a very robust winter. And since about March, our system was full. In fact, we ended up releasing about 700,000 acre-feet of water from the reservoirs into the Salt River. About, 40,000 acre-feet of that actually made it to the Colorado River, which was a nice outcome, but unfortunate that we had to release that much water from our system. Today, we're still about 90% full, even though we had one of our hottest summers on record. So the Salt River project right now is in good shape.
Great. That's great to hear. So last month, there were 2 events. The first one was the Bureau of Reclamation announcing the reduced cuts of Colorado River water, and stakeholders submitting to the Bureau of Reclamation recommendations for operations for Lake Powell and Lake Mead after 2026, which you kind of touched on already. Let's start with the first one. Why were our cuts reduced?
Gary, Brenda referred to prior agreements in 2007 and then the drought contingency plan in 2019. So Arizona, Nevada, California, and Mexico in certain conditions are subject to either making contributions to the lake or having reductions. And so that framework is triggered by different elevations and projections of elevations for the next year, the next calendar year, that are done in August. And so in August, those projections were done by reclamation, and we hit a trigger that requires Arizona to take a 512,000 acre foot reduction in 2024. Brenda mentioned that this year we were in a 592,000 acre foot reduction. So we're gaining back 80,000 acre feet of water, but all of that water through the compensated conservation program is still going to stay in Lake Mead next year anyway. So that's the genesis of the cuts to us. Nevada's taking cuts, and Mexico's also taking cuts. The Lake Mead is not low enough to trigger cuts by California at this point, which is a good thing.
So is there a likelihood that we could go back up to tier 2 before 2026?
Barry, if you look at the 2-year projections, and again, Brenda talked about the Fed's looking out 2 years, it's not showing that that's going to happen in the next 2 years, in 2024, obviously, or 2025. But we'll be keeping an eye on that. We review those studies that are put out every month by reclamation. And if that starts to happen, we'll know it's coming. It won't be a surprise. And of course, a lot of that is going to be dependent upon what happens this year, this coming winter. But as Brenda said, we've stabilized the system really well. So we're not going to have any huge draconian cuts based on the stabilization program, the cuts under the 2 prior agreements, and the additional 3 million acre feet of conservation. But we'll know better what 2025 holds after we get to about April or May of next year.
And what does this mean for Arizona in the short term, long term, Brenda?
So for Arizonans, for Central Arizona project users, and that's nearly 6 million people in the state and 12 tribes, it does mean stability next year. A tier 1 shortage, as Tom explained, means that we have slightly more water officially, but because of other agreements, because so many parties have stepped up for conservation, it means we shouldn't see a difference at the taps. We shouldn't see a difference in our economy. Like, we are prepared for this, and because of so many parties who are conserving, it should look very much the same as 2023.
And you mentioned, people are stepping up. Who is stepping up exactly?
Oh, I wish I had the list in front of me, but certainly the Gila River Indian community, the Fort McDowell, the cities of Phoenix, Tucson, Scottsdale, so many others. Many of the cities who receive CAP water have agreed to conserve and leave some of that water back in Lake Mead. We also have some of the on-river communities are contributing. We have Yuma Mesa Irrigation Drainage District. There are others. It's really been kind of all on board. Everyone has stepped up for this.
Thank you, Brenda. So, one interesting fact that I came across as I was prepping for this was research shows that SRP's water system is less sensitive to climate change. Leslie, can you talk about that? I know that there's been a lot of research done on that, and it's something you're happy about.
We do something we're happy about at Salt River Project. We have done a lot of research on this. We've worked with ASU and U of A, the Agricultural Research Service, and recently Reclamation has confirmed this. And what it really has to do with is that our runoff season for the Salt River Project is really late winter into early spring. And what we're not seeing right now with all of our issues with climate change, which are wreaking havoc on all watersheds, is that we are not seeing warmer temperatures during that time. So on the Colorado River, for instance, we have issues where the system warms quickly and the snow sublimates, it evaporates. On the Salt River watershed, that's not the case. We're having normal runoff where we're having cool periods, and then our water starts to run off. It runs off primarily throughout the late winter, early spring before we start getting into that warmer weather causing sublimation. So we're in a good shape on the Salt River watershed.
And So what's SRP doing to continue to address the climate change?
We have a lot of things going on. One of our biggest efforts we're working on right now is forest restoration and forest health, where we're doing treatments on the watershed to try to promote good watershed health, good runoff on the watershed. We're trying to avoid some of the catastrophic wildfires that have wreaked havoc through northern Arizona. And that's been a huge focus for us. We've been working with the state and local folks, the feds, and we believe that that is one of our best efforts in providing a resilient water supply.
And what's that work entailed?
It's actually what we're doing is manual treatments out on the forest where we're thinning. We're taking down the small diameter trees, leaving the larger diameter trees. But then in that way, what happens is more snow actually makes it to the ground instead of sitting in the trees. And we get more infiltration into the soil and better runoff, and then less fuel for fires, of course.
Okay.
So Gary, can I jump in? And I want to add something, and
Yeah.
and I want to make sure people understand some of the other great things SRP has done in the mid 2000s when some of this research started. SRP's planning process for conjunctively managing its groundwater and surface water resources was a 7-year horizon. They moved to 10 years to be more conservative because of the research, because of what the research was showing, whether climate change impacts were going to impact SRP and simultaneous Colorado River and Salt River project droughts. So, that's 15, almost 20 years ago that they made that shift. So very forward looking and really good resiliency for those folks who are within the Salt River project service area.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks. And so let's talk a little bit about conservation. So I just want to read a couple of things here real quick. I picked this out of the Water Infrastructure Authority 5-year plan. And it says Arizona uses about as much water today as in 1957, despite tremendous population and economic growth. And then we have a Southwest water expert, John Fleck, who noted recently that Arizona's projected water use is on track to be the lowest since 1992. So his quote is, Arizona has demonstrated its ability to take deep cuts without jeopardizing the structure and function of the communities that depend on the Colorado River. So how have we been able to achieve that? We have swimming pools and water parks and golf courses and a growing population.
So Gary, let me start. And first I want to push back a little bit on John Fleck's quote, because I understand he used the word communities, and maybe that's municipalities, but we have Central Arizona project farmers who have lost their water supply, and those impacts on those folks are huge. And that's largely in Pinal County, where they've had to fallow tens of thousands of acres of land because of the loss of their water. So I think, to be fair, there are some impacts on them, and those are mandatory cuts within the priority system. But we have, because of our Groundwater Management Act and the requirement there for increasing conservation from the inception of that act through 2025 for agriculture, municipal and industrial uses, because we've had houses built on farmland and they use much less water per acre, because of other management programs under the groundwater code. One of the jewels of the code is the requirement that houses development shows 100 years of renewable water supplies before the houses can be built. So it's a whole combination of things. Interestingly, the inflection point for the data that you described, 1957 to 2019, is 1980. That's when the Groundwater Management Act was created. And so it's not a coincidence that that's the inflection point. We have a graphic on our website. You can see that graphic, but it's also a whole bunch of other things that have added into that outcome. And we have known for decades that we are in a desert, that these shortages of our surface water supplies, whether they be Colorado River or Salt River project, could impact us. So we have done a lot to prepare for that outcome, and it is why we've been able to weather this storm or lack of storms, so to speak, with relatively minor impacts. Although again, if you're a farmer who had CAP water and now it's gone, the impacts have been pretty severe on those folks.
And Doug, so, tell us about, the EPCOR conservation programs and what's available to the Arizona communities.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. As Tom and Brenda mentioned, EPCOR is participating in some of these large scale conservation programs to leave water in mead. So we participated, I think we're like one of two private entities that participated in the DCP conservation efforts, and in the compensated conservation efforts that are ongoing this year. We're also participating with that. It's a little different for non-designated, under the Assured Water Supply Program, water providers like EPCOR. We've got to kind of juggle. If we conserve the water in mead, which helps out the system overall, that has a trickle-down impact under the Assured Water Supply Program. So as Tom mentioned, that 100-year demonstration of water availability requires any pumping that's done for under groundwater demands, that gets replaced to balance our aquifers. So we've got to juggle that so it doesn't directly impact our customers. So we've been able to roll some of the compensation back into neutralize any impact to our customers. And then we've also are dedicating some of that money to the longer term permanent conservation efforts. So that includes everything from helping customers out with our customer service folks who are dedicated to providing assistance on determining if you've got leaks. We've got rebate programs out there. So if you're upgrading your fixtures, and those kinds of things, those direct on the ground impacts to our customers, that they can save water within their own households.
So Leslie, you also have some conservation programs where you're educating customers and you're creating partnerships with cities.
We do. Yes, we actually work with the cities and support the Water Use It Wisely program. That's a program that's been around for many years, been very, very successful. We host water conservation expos throughout the years where we provide reduced costs on conservation fixtures like smart controllers. We have a pretty concentrated social media campaign and just a general media campaign. So we work really hard to try to get the message out.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Oh, I might add to that. Similarly, we're all here, we support Water Use It Wisely. It is a great resource for anyone who wants to go use it. It's wateruseitwisely.com. It has, not only information about conservation, living in the desert, all of the things we can be doing to save water. But I think you've just heard that we have a history of conservation in Arizona, whether it's the 1980 Groundwater Management Act that has set out increasingly high standards. But what we've seen is our cities are meeting those standards. And while they're not part of that, agriculture as well. We have some of the most efficient agriculture in the West, in Arizona, in the Yuma area. So we realize we live in a desert. We're being smart about it. The water we deliver to CAPs, subcontractors, and customers, they're being smart about how they use it. I'd say many are on the cutting edge about how they do that. But there's a lot you can learn. I do recommend wateruseitwisely.com, and there are a lot of other resources out there. At CAP, we are putting in place, and I don't think it's quite online yet, but a spot where customers can go and you can put in your address and it'll send you to where you need to go to learn conservation. So whether you live in City of Scottsdale and you can use those programs, or Peoria or Cave Creek, it'll send you towards your local resources. So there's a lot of tools out there, and I think it's up to all of us to make sure we're using them.
So Gary, I wanted to add,
Yeah.
you have a long history of conservation. But I think one of the things that the recent reductions on Colorado River has done is focus even more on the need to conserve. In 2022, the legislature gave $200 million to the Water Infrastructure Finance Authority specifically for conservation programs. I know maybe a dozen or 14 or so applications have already been approved. Some of that ag, but mostly municipal. Some of that's for better metering, so folks will know in real time what they're using in their house. But some of that is also for removing grass in either public rights of way that are grandfathered in or around homes. Non-functional turf, I guess, is the new phrase for that. The city of Scottsdale just recently created an ordinance in which new construction is banned from putting in non-functional turf around their homes. So we've done much over the last 40 plus years under the groundwater code, but we have exponentially increased our efforts to conserve water and become even more efficient. And now we have these state-run financial programs. I've got some money, and we're standing up a program as well, $40 million that we got from Governor Hobbs to DWR. So these efforts are going to continue because we need to save every drop. And moving forward in post 2026, it is going to be a focus that we all in the basin need to be as efficient as possible if we're going to stabilize the declining Colorado River.
One thing I always ask you about when you're on this panel, Tom, is what's the status of the desalination pipeline plant and all that? Is it something that's just kind of gone by the wayside, or is it still alive?
So again, I co-chair a group through the treaty process for the United States. We continue to talk about desal. My co-chair now is from the state of Baja California. I think it's moving slowly, but it's still moving. I think the focus has been more with Mexico on the actual management of the river, the conservation programs, potentially Mexico adding on to the 3 million acre foot proposal that the states put in on May 22nd. Brenda has been our champion there, working with Mexico on that program. So desal is moving slowly still, but it's still a number of years away.
Okay. So let's talk about the operating guidelines. So just real quickly, I've gotten some comments in here to make sure that we speak so that we can, talk about things for the lay people. And can you just explain the operating guidelines and how they fit in the quote unquote law of the river? Can you take that, Brenda?
So talking about post 2026, those rules we've talked about putting in place in the past, the 2007 guidelines, the drought contingency plans of 2019, those plus our agreements with Mexico, those all come to an end at the end of 2026. The idea in 2007, we were in a 7-year drought. We had no idea it was going to last 23 years or more. We were starting to talk about climate change, but didn't really know its repercussions at the time. The idea of putting in a 20-year program was that we would learn. We would learn from the operations. We'd learn what worked and how we coordinate, how the U.S. coordinates operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, how the upper basin works with the lower basin. But all that is coming to an end. And what we know is we've learned a lot. We've had to keep coming back to the table because the drought and climate change has made our water situation worse than we expected. We believe we have a smaller river than we had in 2020. In the year 2000. So 20 years ago, we thought we had a lot more water than we do today. And that's going to cause all of us need to come to the table for what these new guidelines or rules are going to look like. But right now, it is an open slate. The federal government started the process asking people to submit scoping comments. Scoping comments is so the U.S. can form in the NEPA process, National Environmental Policy Act, As the process they go through to make this decision. In the past, the 7 states have come together each time to put forward really what is the essential framework of how this should work. That's our goal, and Tom can talk about that, is to have a 7-state major water users on board, working with the tribes, working with the conservation community. Our goal is to come together and have something we all put forward. And that's the goal. The timeline's pretty short. So the United States hope to have a draft environmental impact statement out by December, or in December of next year. So 2024, about 14 months, 15 months from now. But that's actually not that long a time for all the analysis and all the agreements and all the things we need to be working on to find negotiated ways to move forward. There's a lot of work to do, but I think we're up for it. It's not going to be as easy as it was in 2007, and any of us who worked on 2007 know that wasn't easy at all. So we have a lot to work on, and I'm sure others would like to add to that.
And that seems like a blink of an eye almost, you know, when you think about government and, you know, what needs to be done here. So if we could just talk about the process going forward, Tom. I know that, you know, they're gathering these comments, and what are they going to do with these comments?
Look, Gary, I think we anticipate in mid to late October that the federal government will publish a scoping report, which would be a summary of all the comments. And then a very important piece of that report will be a statement called the purpose and need statement. That purpose and need statement really will set the sideboard, so to speak, for what the federal government might analyze and for giving direction in terms of what the alternatives seek to cover in terms of management of the river. To date, we have focused a lot on just the management, conjunctively managing Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and taking reductions in Lake Mead for the lower basin water users, including Mexico. I think in our scoping comments for the state, we made it clear that we also need to maybe look at the system as a whole and not just the smaller focus of just Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And I've said this for many, many months now. If we're going to solve this problem, every water user throughout the basin in Mexico has to contribute. And I mean that on an individual level, on a contractor by contractor, so to speak, level. It is going to be problematic if we end up in a place where people assert they have a senior right over other people, whether that's among the states, between the upper and lower basin, between the lower basin states, or within our own state, because that is a path to litigation. It is not an equitable path, and folks need to step up to the plate. Those who benefit from the river need to contribute to the protection of the river and the Colorado River system. So that's the direction that I'll be looking to go in on behalf of the state. There are lots of different views, obviously, about whether that's the right, wrong, or indifferent thing to do. But as Brenda said, it's going to be much more difficult than it has been in the past, because we now know from modeling and what we now know about climate change that those even with the historical quote unquote senior rights could get cut and cut to zero. So your piece of paper is not going to protect you the way folks thought it might protect you when the 2007 guidelines were being negotiated. It is a new world, and we need to adjust accordingly. But the more people that are going to be impacted, the more difficult it is going to be to come to a collaborative outcome.
And Brenda, you know, you were with the Bureau of Reclamation when they did the drought contingency plan, and just sitting here on the sidelines, you know, it just seemed like such a complex process. I mean, how do we get, and I was looking at the you know, scoping comments, and I mean, you've got so many different stakeholders. How do you get everybody to agree on something?
The magic question.
Yeah.
What I'll say is Reclamation does not have an easy job coming up. But ultimately, what will make that job easier is, number one, we need to come together with a proposal that doesn't seek to destroy any one party, doesn't seek to put all of the risk on any one party, but admits we have a smaller river and we need to find new creative ways to manage that river so that it can serve all of us. But first things first, if we're going to be able to do that, we need to be able to come together in Arizona. Arizonans need to be able to work together. And that means cities, that means agriculture. We have a range of uses in the state of Arizona. I think we've been smart with those uses, but when you're in a 23-year drought exacerbated by climate change, I think you have to realize that things are not going to be like they were before. We need to be able to work together and come together with the tribes, with the conservation community, ag, urban uses. That's not easy, but that's our charge. Because if this goes into litigation, then you will have thousands of parties in litigation. And it will take years and years of uncertainty with courts running this system. I've worked in other systems, the Columbia River, the Sacramento. Those systems are largely run by one judge and one courthouse. We don't want that on the Colorado River. It's not smart for those communities. There's no certainty. You can't invest in your infrastructure because you don't know what water use you're going to have. It's at the whim of a judge. Like, that's not something we want here. And it's been something that we have 100-year history of being careful about that. We haven't been in major litigation on the Colorado River since the 1960s. I think we owe it to all of ourselves, to our communities, to the stability of our economy, to come together and find a solution here.
And what did you put in your scoping comments?
So for Central Arizona Project, and we support the state's comments and the 7 states comments and the lower basin comments. And we also signed comments with fellow delivers in Nevada and the Metropolitan Water District in Southern California. We said a lot of the things Tom just brought up. We said this system needs to be run as a whole. We can't just focus on 2 reservoirs, even though they're the largest. We need to be able to look across the entire system and see how it works. All of us need to be at the table. That means we don't pick out just individual parties who are going to be at risk here. We look at all of the different factors, all of the different users. How does this work? Not easy, right? Reclamation doesn't have an easy job. Tom doesn't have an easy job. No one who is on this panel has an easy job in the next 3 years. But I think many of us have spent our whole careers knowing this was coming and preparing for it. Like, this is our time. The next 3 years will be pivotal for Arizona, and it'll be pivotal for the West. And it's our job to make sure it's done in a smart, reliable way that brings us stability.
So
And-
Garrett, I need to add, so there are really, you have to look at it in terms of moving forward as a process in which there are multiple tables, multiple layers. There's not going to be one giant table with 500 people in it, and we're going to hammer something out. It is going to be a layered process. In Arizona, we have the Arizona Reconsultation Committee. That's close to 50 different stakeholders, including legislators, but all the different water users are represented in that process, including tribes. And that's probably our biggest group gathering. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the director of DWR as the governor's representative on Colorado River, which is a statutorily appointed duty, could have discussions with the United States government. That could be discussions with the United States government and my counterparts in California, Nevada. It could be with my counterparts in the other 6 states or in Mexico. And then that could add in folks like Brenda from CAP, some of the tribes, some of the folks from Yuma. So there's a variety of processes. Last month, the federal government kicked off what they're describing as a tribal convening, where they put all 30 tribes in a room with the 7 state governors' representatives and the federal government to have a table for tried states and the federal government to discuss post 2026. And the second meeting with that group is coming up in early October. So lots of different moving parts, lots of different layers. We will have transparency, but we'll all have also have opportunity to come up with things to share in the transparent venues of the tribal convening or the reconsultation committee and other places. So it's going to be very time consuming, very labor intensive for any party that participates, certainly for my organization and Brenda's organization as well.
I mean, I was going to ask if you guys were going to take any time off in the next 2 years. One thing I wanted to bring up and ask about was, the nuclear option. Some folks are suggesting that we drain Lake Powell and go to a one dam system. And that's been talked about for quite a long time. But now that we're at a crossroads, is this an opportunity for them to come in and make that happen? And what would that do to Arizona if we just went to one dam? Tom, you look eager to
So
answer.
Gary, it is not without the realm of possibility that alternative will be proposed by somebody and the federal government will address it as they will. But if you don't have two dams, the yield of the Colorado system in terms of usable water is going to decrease. And we already have an over-allocated system without enough water to meet the needs. So reducing the yield by only having one major reservoir is probably not a good idea. One of the climate change outcomes that the scientists are telling us is going to occur is an acceleration of the hydrologic cycle, right? So deeper droughts, longer droughts, but on the other end, wetter and more intense precipitation and rainfall and snowpack potentially. That's the opposite end of the hydrologic cycle being accelerated. When that happens, if that happens, we got to capture that water. That's critical. And that's how that system was designed, to capture the water in the high years for use in the low years. And we can't afford to lose the major reservoir, Lake Powell, that can help us do that.
They've also talked about tearing up the compact from 1922. I mean, is that, you're a lawyer, Brenda, is that likely to happen? Is that, what would happen if that happened?
I think there's too many hypotheticals in that question, but what I will say is, when people see things are, maybe swirling a little bit, the anarchists say tear it apart, right? And that's not what we're here for. Over 100 years ago, those who represented Arizona were at the table to work on this compact. And while we didn't agree with a lot of it and didn't sign it until 1944, ultimately what that compact said is we are not going to let one state or any one state take over the river. This state belongs to all of us. This river belongs to every state, the 7 states, and ultimately Mexico, that receive water from it. And we all have the ability to take from that river and the ability to grow from, to base our economies on, and to work with that river. That's ultimately what that compact said in the following laws. So Arizona very much believes, I would say from our point of view at Central Arizona Project, we believe in the law of the river. But the law of the river has given us a lot of creativity. It's given us a lot of space to come to new innovative solutions. So it's not static. We're always looking at what is the best science, what is the best projections. Leslie talked about working with the universities. Like, we are making sure that reclamation is using the best information possible, and there are gaps. In the upper basin, it's hard to tell what uses are, or there's fewer gauges. We need better monitoring, we need better measurement. We need to make sure we're using the absolute best information possible to regulate this river, to operate this river. But I think that's possible. And We are smart, we have the legal framework to do it, and I think it very much will be done in the next 3 years.
So
Go ahead.
can I just add something to that quickly, Gary? One thing to note that the water community, while this is a huge issue, is kind of small. And everybody on the panel here today worked somewhere else before we came to our positions where we are. So we have very diverse backgrounds. We understand the complexities. We understand perspectives. There's a lot of diverse perspectives. But really, the pathway forward is to use all the tools that we have today, the infrastructure that we have today, and to the best of our ability to give us the most flexibility and the most resiliency. And that means what Brenda and Tom have talked about, in we have to re-look at everything. It's how we've gotten to where we are today is connecting up these diverse perspectives and coming up with these new and innovative approaches that maybe aren't so innovative today, but were in their time, and will get there with the next ones too. But people have to come to the table, and it's hard. It's always been hard. Every step gets harder. But we have a lot of really great people working on this. We've got to stay focused, because the nuclear option, blowing everything up just isn't an option. We have to power through this. We have to get to the next step. Water is life. And we need to make sure that we continue to develop and deliver the water that Arizona and the Southwest and all of our partners need.
So
And-
Gary, I'll just say, the law of the river is the foundation. If you're going to add a second story to your house, you don't tear down the whole house and build a new foundation, right? You bolster the foundation you have, you add your second story. That's what this is, and that's what this is going to be. And we want to build on the law of the river and build on that foundation.
And Leslie, SRP also submitted a comment to the federal government. What did you tell them?
We did, and our comments were very similar to what Brenda and Tom have already talked about. And so I'll tell you, before I came to Salt River Project, I spent many years, as Brenda did, at the Bureau of Reclamation. So I feel like I have a good understanding of where they are. And we at SRP were trying to give really SRP perspective comments, but we also agree we need to stay out of court. We've spent a lot of time working in the state of Arizona and with the lower basin states and the basin in total. We don't want to get to a system where we create winners and losers. We want everybody to have a chance to have some piece of that winning pie there. So that was really the crux of our comments, very much, is we need to seek consensus. That's what we've always done. We need to continue to do that. We need federal government to help facilitate that, to push towards that. We think we need to, while the foundation, we need to keep the foundation. We need to think of innovative ways to equitably distribute the water, which is exactly what we've done through the DCP and a whole bunch of these other really, really hard processes. But that was the gist of our comments. We at SRP, we know that in central Arizona, our ability to continue to deliver water hinges on our flexibility, our interconnection with the CAP and the groundwater system and everything else. And so we want to support Arizona throughout all of this. And that's where we landed.
And Doug, where does EPCOR fit into this process?
So EPCOR is part of that ARC committee. We sit on that and chat with Tom about that. I also participate in another subcommittee of not necessarily the largest cities, but the smaller cities and private utilities. And we submitted comments as well. And basically they echoed what has already been said here is we need to come together as a state, support the state, And we can't saddle any one particular state, any one particular water user, any one community with taking all of the cuts. This is going to be, everybody's going to have shared pain here. We all have to work together, and no one's going to be immune.
All right, so we got about 5 minutes left, and so I'm just going to take a couple questions from the audience. And this is to Brenda. Since Ms. Berman said they were working on long-term solutions, could she please elaborate on the ideas, studies, or solutions they have in mind?
What I'll say is the next guidelines, it hasn't yet been determined how long they will last for. We do expect the next guidelines will talk about how water moves from the upper to the lower basin. We think the next guidelines will talk about reductions that will be taken not only by California, Nevada, Arizona, and Mexico water users. And Mexico would be in a separate process. That's an international process, but also how the upper basin will be part of how we stabilize this river. But when we look at how long that will be, there are different ideas out there. So some would like to see it be 30 years for the next set of how we look at this. Some would like it to be 20. I'm sure some would like it to be 10, and some would like it to be perpetual. I think what we've said is it should be long enough that we can make investment, but also be flexible enough that we can learn, because obviously we know a whole lot more now than we did 23 years ago or back in 2007. Like, we need the ability to not pivot, but to use new information to make smarter decisions. So that's a general answer, because I don't think we have specific answers that work for everyone yet. But there's a lot of ideas. We have an incredibly deep bench at CAP of smart, dedicated people who have been working their careers to do this. And I think that's true for all of us who are on this panel. We have incredible staff with a lot of knowledge, whether they're biologists or engineers or economists or modelers. Everything in the toolbox is moving forward. And so we are looking for as long a time as possible that will bring us stability.
All right, we just got a few minutes left, and just want to throw it around for any last comments. Tom, do you have anything to take us out of here with?
So I often get asked what individuals can do to help. And again, certainly in our municipal sector, 60 or 70% of the water use is outdoors. So again, become as efficient as possible. Non-functional turf grass in your front yard probably isn't helping much of anything. Maybe it's a little different grass in your backyard. So think about how you can reduce your water use and become more efficient, but also think about how you can support the efforts of all of us on this panel. And that includes politically. There's a great likelihood that whatever we come up with among 7 states, some element of it might need to be approved by the state legislature, as we had the drought contingency plan approved. So support for things at the legislature as well when they start to surface. And if we end up down at the legislature seeking any kind of approval, that political support is important. Those are going to be tough decisions for the policymakers at the legislature. And so support by their constituents is going to be helpful when we get to that point. And that point's not this year, probably not next session, but maybe the session after. We'll have to wait and see how it plays out.
All right. Our time is up, and I want to thank our panelists, Tom Bushotsky, Brenda Berman, Leslie Myers, and Doug Dunham, and also our sponsors, Central Arizona Project, EPCOR, and Salt River Project. And once again, a great conversation. I enjoyed it, and I think people probably got a little something out of it today. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you to the audience for tuning in. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.